can Singapore achieve a change in government? And if so, how? So I'd really like the topic for today being answered. I don't think that's been sufficiently addressed. Thank you.
Kush, thanks for your question. Can Singapore achieve a change in government? It's a question of timeline, right? I mean, every monolithic authoritarian party has fallen. The one in Mexico, PRI was it?
Yeah,
80 years or whatever.
PRI,
They
yeah.
fell. The LDP fell. Barisan National, UMNO has fallen. So it's more a question of time. So definitely Singapore can achieve a change in government. I mean, how? I don't really predict the future. I'm a historian. I talk about the past. But I mean, quite honestly, as with everywhere else, eventually people grow complacent in power and they misgovern, and an alternative arises. And I think your question is also directed at, if I understand it correctly, about how Singapore can prepare for that day. And I think our duty is really to start creating those alternatives, right? Start creating not just opposition politicians, not just alternatives to the politicians themselves, but I think many of the institutions in Singapore have been so thoroughly undermined, their independence destroyed, co-opted by the government, that we need to think about building up many of these other institutions as well. For me, maybe, if I can also respond a bit to what Wapia was saying, right? Maybe I am a bit cynical because I had so much hope with so many other revolutions around the world, and you see so much backsliding into business as usual. And my fear is that Malaysia will go that way as well, and I really don't want Malaysia to go that way. We had so much hope for Indonesia, for Myanmar, right, for Egypt, it's disappointing, but we move forward. The big exception that I've been thinking a lot about is Tunisia, of course, which was able to make this successful transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And one of the key things is that they had alternatives to government in place and ready to take over when the government fell. And even then, those alternatives did not all go into government, but split themselves and agreed that half of them would go into government, the other half would stay outside and form the loyal opposition. So, this sort of attitude, right, this sacrifice, this idea of a greater good is really, really important. And I do worry about elections arriving, some sort of disaster arriving. The PAP inevitably, eventually will screw up, will lose power, but are we ready for it? So I feel what I'm doing, right, as many of you may be aware, I've started a think tank and a media company to help prepare for that day when Singapore needs alternatives to what the government controls, right? And I would urge other Singaporeans to think about, how you can create alternatives to the government to prepare for the day when those alternatives are needed.